Good morning and welcome to Goshen Free Will Baptist Church Online. Today we're celebrating Pastor Appreciation Day, and because of that, I'm preaching a sermon today that goes along with that. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 17 if you want to follow along. While you're turning there, I want to give us a little bit of background to catch us up in the chapter that we're going to be reading today. If you remember, the book of Exodus starts with the children of Israel in the land of Egypt. After the death of Joseph and everyone from that generation, they became enslaved by the new king. The Bible tells us that this new king of Egypt was one that did not know the history of Joseph and his people, and were concerned that this nation of people living in their land outnumbered the Egyptians. So he enslaved the people of Israel and tried to kill all the male children so that he could slow down the population growth. Under this bondage, they lost all their property rights and became slaves working for whatever project, just the whim of the Egyptians that they came up with. Mainly, they were building these immense structures that we see even today. God called Moses to lead his people out of Egypt to a land that he had promised them. Through many plagues and difficulties, eventually they were brought out of Egypt and began their journey to the land of Canaan. Even though they were let go, the king of Egypt, he immediately sent an army to retrieve the Israelites, thinking he had made a mistake. But God destroyed that army and they were allowed to carry on. After they continued on their journey, they came to a place called Rephidim, which means a resting place, which is where we're going to pick up in today's reading in chapter 17. We're going to start looking at verse 8. The Bible says, "Then came Amalek and fought with the Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose out men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand." So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that the Israelites prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is my banner. For he said, Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Before we break down this passage, one thing we need to note is that chapter 17 starts with the Israelites arriving in this land of Rephidim. They've been traveling for some time. They've been uprooted for their homes and chased down by killers and are tired. They're weary and thirsty, and Moses has brought them to the spot, and it turns out that there's no water here. So immediately the people begin to complain and speak in opposition to Moses and even question if God was on their side or was trying to kill them. One thing you may know is that working with people is hard. People complain about what you do, question your motives, and speak out against you sometimes. A pastor who constantly works with people will be exposed to these very same issues. It's a very difficult but very rewarding calling. God used Moses to provide this water to them and alleviate the problems that Israel was facing at that time. While this multitude of people is taking care of their thirst, they're drinking this water that's supplied to them, the Amalekites come and attack them. Now, these Amalekites, they were the relatives of Esau, and they hated the Israelites. They came up behind the Israelites and began attacking the weakest of the people. Now, this is a great lesson right here that we can learn. Right after times of God's victory, Satan likes to show up and attack us in our weakness. Now, we come to the passage that we read today, and for the rest of the time, I want to look at the support of God's man through the service of God's people, looking at this story of Moses and the Israelites. I first want to look at God's man. For the first thing I see from this passage is that God's man knows where his strength lies. In verse 9, Moses tells Joshua to take command of the army against the Amalekites, and he's going to go up the hill and stand with the rod of God in his uplifted hands. In verse 11, we see this played out. As the battle wages on, as long as he keeps his hands raised, the Israelites would succeed. As soon as his hands would lower, they would fail and start losing. In the Old Testament, the Bible talks about praying with hands lifted. I believe that's what Moses was doing here. He was praying fervently, making intercession to God to his people, with his hands lifted for those that were fighting down below. He knew that if they were going to win this fight, that God would have to step in because their strength was only in God. In verse 15, after the battle, Moses, he sets up an altar of thanksgiving and calls that place Jehovah Nissi. This means the Lord is our banner. This was Moses' way of showing that it was God who had given them the victory, that this is who they were fighting for, the flag that they were fighting under. This is where their strength came from. Now we have to remember that the Amalekites, they were a strong fighting people. They were very accustomed to war. The Israelites, on the other hand, were former slaves that didn't know how to fight and weren't even allowed to own a weapon while they had been under captivity. This is one of the first battles that they had to fight physically, as God had been wiping out the opposition before this. Even though they were doing the fighting, it was still God that brought the victory to them. They definitely looked back and knew that God was the one that gave them the strength and allowed them to win that day. The pastor, like Moses here, must recognize that he is in a fight, and that is only through God's strength that there will be victory in God's church. We're not able to fight alone, but with our strength lying in God, we can see the enemy defeated and God's kingdom built. God's man has to fly this flag of God in his life, because that is where the power lies. The next thing we see is in verse 12. We see that God's man gets tired. Moses, he was standing with his arms lifted over these fighting men below and urgently praying for them. We read in verse 12 that he became tired. He began to let his arms slip down, which resulted in the men fighting below to begin to lose. He needed rest. So Aaron and Hur, who was there beside him, they found a rock for him to sit on, and he needed support, so they came alongside him and supported his arms. Now, in the short time that I've been in ministry, I've quickly learned that pastoring, while again very rewarding, can be exhausting both emotionally and physically at times. I don't know how many times I've heard of people telling pastors how much they would love to have his job because he only works one day a week. Most of the time the people are joking, but really there's more involved in pastoring than that. Pastors called upon any hour of the day to help those in need and comfort those that are sick and dying, counseling those in all kinds of troubles, preparing hours for sermons and lessons. And the pastor doesn't do this coldly in a vacuum like a robot. He's hurting and crying with these people as well. This is his people. This takes an emotional and physical toll on God's man. And this can cause him to become tired and weary, and he needs rest and support of his people. I also see that God's man, with thanks, remembers the victories. In verse 14, God tells Moses to write down this story so that it can be retold again and again. A pastor needs to remember those victories, no matter how big or small, that God produces in his life and in the church. A lot of times you'll hear preachers tell stories of what God has done in the past, and these are great ways that we can learn how God can work in our lives and take encouragement from that. Sometimes we can become discouraged comparing ourselves to bigger churches around us, but we need to be encouraged by what God is doing in our church and remind each other of this. We need to celebrate the wins in our church. What we see in the next verse, that Moses built an altar thanking God for the victory. He was thankful for what God had done. We need to remember to thank God for what he has done and be grateful for what he's working through us. Too many times we move on to the next thing and forget to stop and take some time to thank God and celebrate what he has done. He wants that worship. He's created us to worship him. He wants that glory. And he wants us to be encouraged by what he's doing through us. The last thing I see of God's man is that he invests in those underneath him. Let's look at verse 14 again. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. God told Moses to write down what had happened that day, and he specifically mentions to do it for Joshua. We know today that Joshua would be the successor of Moses. God was having Moses invest time and training into Joshua long before Joshua even stood up to lead the people. One of the pastor's tasks is preparing to hand off the baton to the next generation, investing time and training and discipling those that will lead after he is gone. We see this all throughout the Bible. Paul, he tells Timothy to do this in 2 Timothy chapter 2. He says, "And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also." We have to be investing in those coming up behind us. We've looked at God's man. Now let's take a quick look at God's people. The first area I want to look at dealing with God's people is in verse 9. It's the area, it's the idea that God's people have to be in the fight. Moses, he's up on the hill praying to God while Joshua is down in the valley leading the people in the fight. We need people that will fight for the pastor like Joshua did for Moses. We're all in this together. We all have different roles to play, but we're in this together. 1 Corinthians 12 says, "For as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ." We're not all called to pastor, to sing, to teach, but we are all, every one of us, called to do something. We have so many that come looking for what the church can do for them. And that's the wrong mindset to have. We need to come seeing where God wants us to serve. These are our fellow brothers and sisters, and we need to all help one another in this fight. It's not the pastor's responsibility to do everything in the church. We are all called to take part in the work of the church. We have to take ownership of our church with the mindset that this is where God has placed me and I need to get to work there where He has placed me. We have to be in the fight. The next thing I see is that God's people follow God's commands. Verse 10 tells us, "So Joshua did as Moses had said to him." Moses, as God's ordained leader of the Israelites, commanded Joshua to lead the people into battle. Joshua followed the command and did so. The Bible doesn't record that he argued with Moses or he tried to do something else or tried to improve. He just followed the play. In sports, teams will practice and drill over and over again how to make one particular play before they repeat that same process on the next play. A coach, he doesn't want some rogue player that does whatever he wants. He wants the entire team to make the play, to do what they practice for the benefit of the whole team. While the pastor is not to be a dictator with a demanding spirit, we need to recognize that God has ordained the pastor as the head of the church, leading with the help of godly men and women under him. They're to make the play that God has established in His Word. Rogue Christians who want to call an audible and do whatever they want hurt the team, and we're not able to make the finish goal. We struggle with this sometimes because we all have this rebellious streak, but ultimately we have authorities placed over us that we need to submit to. We need to follow those that God has placed over us. The last thing I see of God's people is that they need to feel the needs of God's man. Look at verse 12 again with me. It says, "But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun." While Moses is up on the hill praying for those in the fight, and Joshua is down in the valley leading the fight, Aaron and Hur are right there beside Moses. They, as leaders of the people, saw that Moses had a real need. Like we said before, Moses was tired and he needed support. They found him something to sit on and help God's man shoulder the weight of his arms. A church needs to be actively looking out for their pastor, giving them time of rest and praying for him and seeing if there are any weights that he needs help lifting. Moses, he was no different than the rest of the people. And a pastor is the same as you. He has needs and he struggles with things as well. God has placed the pastor over the people as a shepherd, and we need to encourage, pray, and strengthen him like he does for many of us. Aaron and Hur, they didn't get all wrapped up in their discomfort or their needs at that time, but they saw that Moses had a need and did something about that. We need to take the initiative and strengthen the pastor. It doesn't have to be anything big or extravagant. It can be simple as sending him a text message or find out a small thing he likes, gifts it to him like candy or something, put a note on it, say, hey, I'm praying for you. It's not so much about the gift or what you're doing. It's the idea that you're letting the pastor know that he is in your thoughts and prayers and want to see God use him in the church. Because in this church is your friends and your family. You want to see them live victorious Christian lives, and God has ordained shepherds over his people to make sure that this happens. We need to remember that these shepherds are human as well and need to be encouraged and strengthened. As we close, I know we looked at several things, but what is it that we can take home with us today? God has placed over us men that are charged to lead their people with his strength and discipling and mentoring them. All the while knowing that these are just men that have weaknesses and get tired. We need to pray for them and encourage the pastor, looking for ways to give him rest and support. This morning, I hope I've challenged you to either continue in doing the very thing, or you need to begin doing that. We're all in this together, and we need to build each other up so that we're able to do good works.